Hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome back to the Emotional Wellness Series. This is session 5, and it is so wonderful to see everybody today. I'm Meredith, the founder of Parkinson's Point, and we have Luci Draayer with us here today. And she is going to be speaking on grief and loss and chronic illness and how we can kind of navigate through those pretty heavy emotions. So hopefully you can hear us all okay virtually. If you want to give us a thumbs up. And if you guys have questions, please put those in the chat and we'll be sure to bring them up. And then for those of you in person, just let us know if you have a question. We'll come by. Okay. With that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Luci.
Are we good to go? Thanks. It's nice to be here. And for those of you virtually, there's some wonderful looking people over here. So if you see just this side of me, it's because I'm looking at them for a good part of the presentation. So my name is Luci Draayer. I'm with Denver Counseling and Care Consultation, and that is my practice. It is a counseling and care consultation practice that deals with individuals living with chronic illness and their caregivers and care partners, and some of the anticipatory planning that's needed when you're living with a condition like that. So we're here today to talk about grief and loss, and I think we have much to learn from each other. Those of you who are joining us remotely, please don't hesitate to put in your thoughts and comments. I'll try to leave a little bit of time afterwards to hear some of what your observations are and what some of your experiences are. So I want to talk first a little bit about grief as just a part of living. A good place to start is to say, what is grief? Well, it's a natural feeling that comes after loss. It's a natural feeling that comes after loss. If you think about it, we're made to grieve, right? We are made to grieve. It's actually part and parcel of many, many spiritual traditions. In the Christian tradition, the Bible talks about Jesus weeping. It talks about calling those who mourn blessed. In Buddhist philosophy, grief is seen as a time of real spiritual awakening if one is open to grief. And even in Jewish traditions in the Old Testament, we read about exiled Israelites who sat by the rivers and mourned what they were losing. So grief is a piece of living. It's also a feeling. It's not just an intellectual exercise that I can give you a handout on and say, follow steps 1 to 5, and then you'll be done. It's a feeling, and there's a process to it that's not linear. It can be kind of messy. It can be surprising at times, and sometimes it's uncomfortable. But it also can be very cathartic for people who face their losses. And then it's about loss. And obviously, we think a lot about death. And when we think of loss, the loss of people who are close to us, the death of pets. But there's so many other kinds of losses that cause us to grieve. Health, that's why we're here today. Relationships, jobs, moving, and other intangible things like our sense of security, certainty, our identity, and our dreams. So loss is a piece that's around us all the time, both in concrete ways and intangible ways. I want to say just a couple of things about our society and grief. And one of the reasons for that is, we all operate within cultures. We operate within our own individual family culture. We operate within a broader family culture, within the family culture possibly of our partners and spouses, but then we also operate within our societal cultures. And we aren't in a culture that necessarily welcomes and has taught us what to do with grief. There's 2 authors of a grief handbook, James and Friedman, and they say, you know what, we're taught to acquire in our culture, but we're not taught how to lose. We're taught how to get this and get that and have this kind of goal to gain this and to gain that, but we don't really live in a culture that teaches us how to lose. Others say that sometimes our American culture isn't one that really acknowledges loss because we're too heavily focused on positivity. We're too heavily focused on happiness. Those aren't bad things, but some would say, is there an overbalance so that we're not a people that really knows how to grieve? We've just come through the pandemic, or we are still on our way out of the pandemic, depending on how you look at it. And a lot of folks say that that was one of the first times that our world was in communal grief, and that there was such a pileup of loss that we hardly knew how to articulate it. I want to read you a quote from Psychology Today. You've probably heard of that magazine. And this is from July 2020. So think back to July 2020, right? March 2020, late February 2020 was when we were starting to realize, oh, there's something big going on here. Things started shutting down, and we came through those months. I think I remember in May doing a drive-by birthday party for a young grandchild, and we were all sitting outside in the back of a pickup truck. And so it's just we forget how that really is not that long ago. So this is in the issue of July of that year, an article, and this is the quote. The pandemic has also forced into the open the awareness that there's a multitude of losses that garner no memorial placard. There's no placard about all of this, yet beg for acknowledgement and attention. From the extraordinary loss of certainty and security to the more concrete losses of business, job, health, without which so many of us lose that most essential of things, our identity. So that was a world in grief. That's our society in grief. So grieving is certainly a part of living and dying during that time and during all of life. So what about acknowledging grief? Why does that really matter? Why would Meredith have me standing up here today? What is this about grief and loss that might be so relevant and be begging our attention? Why does this really matter? Or does it really matter? So if grief is part of living, and we live in a culture that may not lend itself towards teaching us about grief as much as it should, you can see then how it becomes a bit of a challenge for us to acknowledge it in our lives. Why does it matter? Well, have any of you ever heard of that old saying, to live is to lose? Yeah, some of you are nodding your head. Yeah, to live is to lose. There's always going to be something to grieve. It's kind of that get used to it idea, right? There's always going to be something to grieve. Grief is a universal experience. Not a single one of us has escaped this or will escape it. By definition, it's not going to be comfortable, or it is not comfortable. Also, by definition, it puts us into what I call a tunnel of transition. So if you think of that analogy of a tunnel, we all know the Eisenhower Tunnel, right? Think of going up that hill, as you're headed west and you're going in it. And have you ever gone into that tunnel when it's sunny when you go in and it's snowing on the other side? So many of us Coloradoans have had that experience if you've been here long enough. But a tunnel of transition, by definition, is I go into that tunnel, I know where I came from. But on the other side, I'm not quite sure what I'm going to find. And that's what the tunnel of transition with grief does for us. We know where we came from. We know the life before, but we're not quite sure what it's going to look like on the other side coming out. So there will always be something to grieve for every single one of us. It's also part and parcel of living with chronic conditions, and that's a piece of the relevance for my being with you today. I was going to look up some numbers and I ran out of time, but there is a rapid increase in the number of individuals living in our society and in the world with chronic conditions. Chronic as opposed to acute, meaning acute may be fixable. Let's do these steps and your arm will heal, or this cancer chemo and in 6 months. Chronic means ongoing and very often for people progressive. So there's a real rise in the number of people living with, not one, but even 2 or more chronic conditions. Most of this is due to the aging population of our world and our culture, but it's also due to the advancements in care and in treatment of a number of conditions. And If you just think of, for instance, what's available in treatments today for Parkinson's disease that wasn't 25 years ago, just simply the number of medications alone, let alone procedures, medications that make the dopamine work better, medications that slow progression, and on it goes. So there's a real rise in these situations because of our aging population and also all kinds of other neural conditions. But we've got also better treatments. So people are living longer, but many with limitations. We're living longer, but many of us with limitations. That really highlights the importance then of living not only with making sure you have good medical experts treating you, but also figuring out how do you live in an emotionally healthy way with something that you could live with for many, many years. Years ago, I heard Muhammad Ali's doctor speak, and he said, I think he was a man, he looked to be in about his 60s at the time, and he said, you know, when I started my career, I used to be able to look at new Parkinson's patients, and in my head, I would think, oh yeah, you'll probably be gone in about 8 years. He said, now I can look at many patients and honestly say to them, you're going to come close to living most of your lifespan, but it will be with a condition. That's a change. So how do we manage that emotionally? And part of the emotional management is facing our grief and loss. So stick with me on this. If this is one of the things I would ask, if you hear anything today, understand this about cycles of grief when it comes to dealing with health conditions. And that is that there are repeated cycles of grief as you deal with changing and progressive and chronic health conditions. This is a concept from Mary Kathleen Rose, who talks about we get the initial loss that comes our way, or the initial trigger. You know, maybe it's the news of the diagnosis. I have what? You're telling me I have this? And there's a sense then of disruption, of shock, of protest in our brains and in our psyches. And then we kind of recalibrate. We feel that period of disorganization, of being really at loose ends. And then we begin to bring order to our lives and to our psyches in terms of, okay, now what? The challenge isn't just that this happens once. This is a repeated cycle as you live with illness. You go through periods of steadiness, right? And then periods where things just seem really out of whack. And then you kind of regroup. And then things hopefully are steady for a bit again. But there's always going to be a change. That's what makes understanding and knowing how to grieve and deal with loss so important when it comes to illness. And then finally, the reason why it matters is that if you ignore grief and loss too much, it's going to find you anyway. It's going to find you anyway. It's going to find all of us because it's a piece of life. It may show its way in anger, depression, exacerbated physical symptoms, numbing behaviors like use of alcohol, denial, avoidance, but unattended grief does find us. It's just a question of how is it going to show itself. We may as well do the work so that it shows itself in a healthy way, right? So what is it that we want to accomplish? What, why? What should I look for if I'm going to grieve and if I'm going to face my losses? Why? What's to be accomplished? I just want to, there's so much written out by so many providers and authors who write a lot about grief, but just a couple key thoughts from some of them about the importance of grieving and the purpose of grieving and facing loss. George Bonanno, and he's one of the gentlemen who wrote for the Psychology Today article, says that the goal of grief is to recalibrate our relationship to what we've lost. He says the brain has to get used to that without. Recalibrating so that we get used to what we now no longer have. It's reconstructing who we are since our loss. David Kessler, he is a former mentee of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. You may know her as the person who wrote a lot about death and dying. He says it's to remember your loss with more love than pain. That's a tall order. How do I remember such a significant loss with more love than pain? That's what he says. And learning what's required to make life feel whole again. James and Friedman, I referenced them, and I didn't bring the book with me, but they have the workbook on grief. They say that it's discovering and completing what was unfinished in your unique relationship to what you've lost. Discovering and completing what might have been unfinished. But all of these authors and all of these writers and those who study grief and loss, it's a theme around reorienting ourselves to a life without something that we used to have. Reorienting ourselves to that which we no longer have, to a life in which that person or that thing is no longer with us. Okay. I want to talk just a little bit about types of grief, just because I know that you hear these terms. Just to give you a bit of an idea of distinguishing between some of those. And then we're going to talk more about strategies and ways for you to take a look at yourself in terms of the losses that you face. So types of grief, these more than one may apply to you or to me. First is ambiguous grief. Ambiguous grief tends to be non-death losses. So chronic illness would be one of those, right? Individuals who are adopted sometimes feel a sense of loss of not knowing their real biological connection. People who've been in foster care. Having a loved one incarcerated is an ambiguous loss. The other one that can be relevant to a lot of families with neurological conditions is the sense of a personality change for a loved one who's undergoing, who has progressive cognitive changes. That sense of here but not here. This is the person I've known for so long, but yet it's like a different kind of person, a different person that I've known, that here but not here. And the thing about ambiguous loss is it has a bit of a notion of kind of chronic mourning. I'm never quite done. I'm never quite done. There's always something, sadness lingering around here, which means there's a couple key tasks, psychological tasks. One is just learning to tolerate the ambiguity. It's hard to have closure around someone whose Alzheimer's is advancing so far that they're a very different person and yet they're still with you. So how do I live with that ambiguity and yet face my loss? The other is just reframing to understand that you can have both. Your loved one can be both present and not present at the same time. So there's a lot of work within our heads that we need to do emotionally around that. Another kind of grief is anticipatory grief. Familiar with that, I'm sure. Very common with progressive illness. The sense that we're getting closer to the end or that things are changing, even if the end is months or even years off. Some people sometimes say to me, do you think since I'm grieving so much now that when he or she is no longer here, I won't have to grieve as much? Maybe, maybe not. It all depends. Everybody's very individual. But that's anticipatory grief. Delayed grief is grief that's been put on the shelf. And if you think about it, there's often a really good reason for this. Sometimes people simply don't have the space to face some of the losses that are in their lives because they have to rightly be so consumed with dealing with other practical matters at hand. I'm thinking of widowed parents who have to get back to work because they still have to put food on the table for the kids who are still at home. In terms of health, sudden medical crises that demand that a family or a partner or a spouse jump in and do all kinds of stuff they've never done before because now the stroke has happened and so-and-so is going to rehab and we'll be home in 2 weeks and I have to do X, Y, and Z. How do I even have time to think about what I'm feeling? Often that's when I get the calls several months later when the dust has settled a little, and that's when somebody realizes there's just a lot of emotions about what's just happened. So there's understandable reasons sometimes why grief gets delayed, but it isn't unusual then that the grief, when it does come off the shelf, comes off in a pretty strong way. And then finally, there can be complicated grief. I don't know if any of you have experienced this, but that's the kind of grief that individuals face when there are some really significant barriers to facing their loss. And healing can take a longer period of time and sometimes can be very prolonged. Often who one is before that loss and how they've coped is a factor in how they're dealing with the grief. There's often really challenging contributing factors in these kinds of situations: sudden traumatic deaths, motor vehicle accidents, that kind of thing. There might be unfinished business with the person who's died. that you're never going to get back and that you can't, quote unquote, fix. And sometimes it's because big losses have happened very close together, that it's almost too hard to take a look at everything all at once. That's complicated grief. And then finally, there's just disenfranchised grief. And that's the grief that tends to be minimized by other people. You know, I know, I know you had that cat for 18 years, but my goodness, it was just a pet. That's disenfranchised grief. That's one example. So these are just some of the terms that you hear, and they can fit, more than one can fit. I try not to get too hung up in labels, but did want you to know that that's some of what's talked about. So let's spend a little bit of time on, just watching my time here a little bit, on personal grief, your personal approach to grief. And I want to throw some things your way, see if any of this is useful to you. You may actually have some of your own ideas of things that you use that help to throw out later that I think would be great to hear. So the first is to recognize your own loss narrative. What is your loss story? I gave you some examples earlier. We all have one. We all have one. There's many versions online of a tool that are called like loss intensity graphs, where you can actually do a visual on a piece of paper about what your loss story looks like. When did you have losses in your life? At what age? How intense were they? How close did they come together? What type were they? How well resolved are they? And that begins to give you a picture of your loss story. I ask clients often about losses, and sometimes have them do this, because how we've handled past losses can very much impact how I'm handling current losses, especially if there's some unresolved losses from the past. So our loss story really matters, really matters. Just a couple of examples. I have a caregiver client who is a young professional. He has a young family. He would describe himself as having a charmed life. And when I asked him a little bit about losses, it was hard for him to think of any. He mentioned that his parents put down his family dog while he was away at college and didn't tell him till later. That bothered him because they didn't feel he could handle it, and he knew he could, and he wished that they had told him. And that the other loss he could think of was that he didn't get into his first choice of graduate school until 2 years ago, when his wife very suddenly had a very serious head trauma that was very serious for a bit. She's fully recovered now, but there were a lot of unknowns for a while, followed within 6 months with his mother's own diagnosis of a very, very serious neurological illness. So it goes from very little to boom. That's his loss story right now. I had a classmate. I think of this situation often. Back when I was in middle school, he was the oldest of 4 children. His mother died in middle school of breast cancer. So his father was a widow tending to these 4 children. And by the way, 2 of those children were adopted. Over the years, my classmate died a young age of a very fast-growing brain tumor. His biological sister died of the same breast cancer her mother had. One of the adopted children died in a motor vehicle accident. And I cannot remember about the 4th child, but this gentleman, this father, that was his loss story. Huge, huge loss, huge, huge loss. I think of another client a number of years ago her loss story was that her mother died when she was a teenager. She was the oldest of 5 children. She immediately was thrown into the job to do the job that mom used to do. She had to cook for the rest of those kids. She had to do their laundry. She had to get them out to school. She had to get herself out to school. And she coped. We talk about delayed grief. She coped physically. She was an athlete. She was able to do a lot. And so she expressed herself a lot in what she could do physically. Jumping ahead years, where she's given a very serious neurological diagnosis that keeps her from doing the physical activity that helped her emotionally. And she hardly knew what to do, because that's how her loss story impacted how she coped. with our own illness. We all have our loss stories, and knowing what that is really, really important. Also important to recognize signs that it's time to grieve. What do those look like for you? It can be different for all of us. Am I isolating more? Am I drinking more? Am I avoiding? Am I getting more depressed? Do I have a sense of just everything overwhelms me? Everything just overwhelms me. What are the signs that perhaps it's time to grieve? And then, do you know what your personal style of grieving is? Do you know what your personal style of grieving is? It's very individual for every single one of us. It's not a right or wrong. It's just, what is it for you? Do I need to be alone? Do I need to be with somebody? Do I need to get out in nature? There's some experts distinguish between intuitive grievers and instrumental grievers. Intuitive grievers are those who are more in touch with their feelings and more feeling oriented. Instrumental is more the practical person who may not spend a lot of time crying, but may go for that hard run, or may go down into the garage, into the wood shop, and just hammer away at some project for a while. That's more the instrumental griever. One person said, if I cried every day, it's still not going to bring so-and-so back. Like, what's the use of crying? Usually for people like that, it's a healthy sign if that's how they cope with most of life, where we get concerned if it's a different way of coping. That suggests something's being avoided. So a simple tool to use, if you're sitting here thinking, okay, great, but now what do I do? I'm not used to thinking about this kind of stuff that often. What do I do? What is a strategy? So I'm supposed to go grieve, or so I'm supposed to go face my loss. What should I do? Here's 4 simple questions. Sit with it yourself. Write if you'd like. Speak into your recorder in your phone. What have I lost? How do I feel about that loss? There's hundreds and hundreds of feeling words. But they say they really come down to 4 basic ones: mad, sad, glad, and scared. So if you can't think of feeling words, just think, am I mad? Am I sad? Am I glad? Am I scared? And usually you'll think of a word under there. How do I feel about my loss? Who am I now without my loss? Who am I now that I can no longer drive? Who am I now without so-and-so in my life? And then, now what? The reason that now what question is so important, and I think it's in the handout, is that it helps us to think about action. Now what? It is, now what? What have I lost? How do I feel? Who am I now without? Now what? Very simple tool to use. Might want to put on a sticky note. And then, well, let me back up. So if one thing I would like you to remember is the cycles, the other is this simple tool, and the third is understanding triggers. Facing your triggers as they relate to losses. So there's a phrase, what is it called? Is it an acronym when each letter spells something? Okay, oh, thank you. It's an acronym called STUGS. Sudden temporary upsurges in grief. Again, if you've been through a significant loss, you'll relate to this immediately, and you may want to share some of them later. It is those unexpected moments that come, and by the way, let me first say they are completely normal. These triggers are normal and a part of grief and loss. They're just normal. You can't stop them, but you can learn how to manage and cope with them. They're unpredictable. You don't know when they're going to come. That's the nature of something that's unpredictable. You can't say when they're going to come. They can be small, but they can produce an intense reaction. We can't stop, and they often can be uncomfortable. STUGS, sudden temporary upsurges in grief. Could I ask for a brief show of hands for anybody who automatically knows, I kind of know what she's talking about? Yeah, most of your hands are going up. Most of your hands are going up. So let me give you some examples. Odors. My mother she passed away 7 years ago this month. She was a bread baker, and bread machines were not in her world at all. It was by hand. I can picture that kneading motion. I still, if I smell bread baking today, I think of my mom. I resolved her loss, so it's a really pleasant memory when I smell bread now. But early on, it was a sense of loss. An empty place at the table. I have a client who lost her husband a couple of months ago. She lives in a care community downtown. And she told me, she talked about some of her family members come to see her periodically and have dinner. She talked about being down in the dining room, sitting at a different table than they used to sit at. And she said, in my view, was a table we always used to sit at, and all I could think and see was that empty spot. The visual, that's a trigger. A shared song or activity. I have another caregiver client whose wife had a young onset dementia and is now in a care facility. They backpacked a lot together. He's finding comfort in solo backpacking right now, but it's also a trigger. Because when you're hiking and backpacking, you want to point something out to someone and you're by yourself. Who do you point it out to? So it's a trigger. Examples of triggers related to illness. Let me just give you some ideas and see if maybe you relate to some of these. Seeing somebody do something that you can no longer do. Being told by your doctor that it's time for a new treatment or another layer of treatment or a new medication. Seeing somebody with your diagnosis who might be further along the path than you. For caregivers, having to take on a task at home that was just automatically done by your partner or spouse. Gassing the cars, doing the laundry, taking the trash out. Those can be triggers. Little things, aren't they? But they can produce a strong reaction about grief and loss because of what they represent. And back to the comment about those cycles of grief, those are the kind of triggers that can put you into a cycle of grief that you have to acknowledge and work through. So I'll comment about some specific strategies that you may choose to use, or maybe you have others. One is writing. Letters. Letters to the loved one you've lost, or a letter as though it's coming from a loved one who is no longer with you. Letters to your healthy self, or letters as though coming from the healthy self that you had once knew. Journaling. Some people find a lot of comfort in journaling, not everybody, but it can be a good way to get some thoughts out on paper. Taking pictures that reflect your loss. I'll give you one other example in my life with my mother. My sister this summer, she lives in a small Midwestern town and in an old home. And she texted me one day that she said, I never go around to this side of the house. I hardly ever do that. I hardly ever do that. And I did today, and you'll never guess what I found. End of text. So in my own snarky way, I said, a snake? No. Marijuana plant? No. And all kinds of other things. And finally, what pops up is a photo of a beautiful sunflower. Well, my mother was a Kansas farm girl. And one of the things about my mother that she would talk about is seeing the wild sunflowers along the road. So it was a wonderful memory for us to share because of this picture that my sister found. Taking pictures of things that help. It's a good thing for grief. Weeping or not, we talked about that a little bit. Engaging with music. Music seems to tap emotions in a different way, taps into a different part of us. For some people, that's really meaningful. Music is a huge piece of their life. For others, not so much, but it can be a really, really good way to tap into your thoughts about loss and your grief. Napping, take a nap. The reason I say that is that I don't think enough attention is given to the fact that grief also has a physical component to it. Grief has a physical component to it, and it's documented. Fatigue can be very real. So can poor concentration or fuzziness. So can loss of appetite or too much appetite, overeating as a way to comfort yourself. And it's documented that we have less immunity to infection. So there's a lot of physiological components to grief. And perhaps in the moment, one of the best things you can do is go take a nap. It's very possible. It's okay. It's okay. Reading or reciting spiritual reflections or mantras. For people of faith, this can be very comforting. Prayers, scriptural readings, other kinds of philosophical readings. Some people benefit a lot from meditation apps and from yoga. One of my favorite mantras comes from an MS patient years ago. She was in her mid-30s at the time. She shared it with a group that I was leading. I don't like it. It is. I'm doing the best I can. Simple mantra. I don't like it. It is. I'm doing the best I can. And then establishing rituals that honor routines or anniversaries. Some people benefit from this a lot. Going to the cemetery regularly. I remember a coworker years ago who was widowed young with 4 children and had remarried. Very nice blended family, but her routine with her 4 children, even as they moved into young adulthood, every single Christmas there was a gathering with just them, the mom and the 4 kids, and they still went out and each bought an ornament in honor of their dad. Went on for years. Those kind of rituals can be very, very meaningful. And there might even be some rituals you think about around the losses that have gone on related to your illness. What might those look like? Not for everybody, but maybe for you. Practicing gratitude as a way to keep perspective. So much of coping and living with chronic conditions is balancing hope and reality. And maybe some of you have heard me say that. That's so much one of the key psychological tasks of living with conditions is balancing hope and reality. There's a psychologist in the Colorado Springs who says, you can hold both in your hands. You can hold both in your hands. But if you err too much consistently on the side of reality, you lean towards despair. Why would you get out of bed in the morning if all you're going to do is look at reality? If you err too much on the side of hope, that puts you into the realm too much of avoidance and denial. Oh, I'll deal with it later. I'll just pretend it's not going on. So balancing hope and reality, and a part of that is practicing gratitude. I mourn, I grieve that I can't rake my leaves anymore. Do you know how much I used to like to rake leaves? That's a loss. But maybe I can sit, at least I have this beautiful tree to look at out of my kitchen window. Balancing hope, reality, practicing gratitude. Another option is to take a break. We all benefit from just putting some hard things on the shelf periodically. Just for a short time. Change the scenery, change your routine. Sit in a different chair on your patio. Treat yourself to a cinnamon roll instead of your oatmeal every morning, a day a week. Go away overnight. Put a funny movie on for an hour and a half in the afternoon, or go to a funny movie, even if you don't feel like it. Change it up. Take a break. It might help. And then finally, if you're stuck, get some help. Sometimes the griefs that come our way, especially if they're in conjunction with so many other things, can be a really tall order, can be really heavy. And there's different ways to get help. There's grief support groups. There's individuals who specialize in grief. There's individuals who work with people who are dealing with illness. And sometimes just a handful of sessions with someone who's used to hearing those stories, it might have some strategies can be helpful. So a couple of comments just to close, and then we can take some comments from those of you online, but also those of you here, questions. George Bonanno talks about grief coming not so much in predictable stages as he does emotional experiences that are more like waves or oscillations. So grief, again, is not that linear line. It's not that linear line. but more waves and oscillations. Sometimes it feels big, and then it recedes, and then it comes back. That's the nature of grief. He says those that get through, the first thing they do is they engage with their loss. They look at it. It's right there. They make sure it's in their face. The first thing they do is they engage with their loss. But they use that then to tap into their own resilience. You know, we all have resilience that we think we don't have. Tap into the resilience that keeps them from settling into despair. That allows us to ask some of those questions we need to ask. What do I need to do? What am I able to do? What will help me get through the day? We have a noise out there, don't we? That's okay. Yeah. For those of you online, we have a vehicle noise going on outside. Bonanno says that you need to trust that eventually you will calibrate your loss to living a life without that which you used to have. So I'd like to take a couple minutes, just in closing, if it's okay with you, just to invite your own personal reflection with yourself. If you want, you may close your eyes, but you don't have to. Just to think about a current loss that you may be experiencing or you may be aware is on the horizon. What is that? Is it something concrete? Is it something more nebulous? Not sure who I am. I had dreams of doing such and such. I don't think so. How do you feel about that? Remember that that feeling is natural. It's natural. It's okay to feel that. Who are you now? What doesn't change? What might change? And now what? What can I do now? What will help me? And when you're ready, you can open your eyes. Meredith, everybody had access to the handout on quotes, right? So for those of you online, and I think in your stapled handouts, you'll see a page of just a couple of quotes for your reflection, as well as some resources. I'm going to just read a couple of those quotes, and then really eager to hear any of your comments or your observations, your questions. These kinds of settings are really good to learn from each other. Grief gives us a job. It's a command to slow down, to turn inward, and to recalibrate living in a world without our partner, without our friend, without our plans, whatever it is that's gone. And then two others, David Kessler, we grieve in character. That's a reminder that the way you grieve is the way you grieve, and it's okay. And then from the Grief Recovery Handbook, time itself does not heal. It's what you do within time that will help you complete the pain caused by loss. Time itself does not heal. It's what you do within time that will help you complete the pain caused by loss. You'll also see a quote there by Stephen Colbert and a reference to Anderson Cooper's podcast below. Are any of you aware of what Anderson Cooper has done with his podcasts on grief? It's the CNN anchor. So he has his own stories of loss in his life, and he started doing some stuff just informally on his own as he was going through his mother's belongings. And what led to that is him doing some podcasts with different celebrities about losses they've had in their life. And Stephen Colbert it's a very powerful interview with him. And his comment here is very strong, which is learn to love the thing you most wish had never happened. I find that well, I don't know. But that is what he said. But that's in terms of just hearing people speak about their own experiences with grief, I would really recommend those podcasts. And as Colbert says, be grateful for what it's taught you. Sometimes those who've been before, gone on the path before in their own way, have a lot to teach us. So, all right, I'm open for any comments. Those of you online, if you want to put anything into the chat, give me some thoughts, feedback. What kind of thinking do you have? Yes, and I'll repeat it for people who can't hear. Or do you want to do it, Meredith? Go ahead.
Very much. I realized that I haven't forgiven my mother for killing my dog while I was gone away at summer camp.
Yeah.
And I need to work on that. My question for you is, how do you see people of faith dealing with grief in a different way than people that might not necessarily experience faith in whatever their being is?
How do I see people of faith dealing with things differently? That's a really good question, because it taps into our own very personal values and personal beliefs about how we live in this world, how we see ourselves in this world, right? Even for me, Luci, as an individual, and the framework that I operate out of. The evidence is that not just with grief, but more broadly in terms of coping and those who study what's called self-efficacy and resiliency, is that those who have some kind of belief system tend to cope and do better. And that they don't, often it's framed kind of in that general terms, not as this kind of belief system, but some kind of spiritual belief system that grounds them often do better. Anecdotally, it's a little hard for me. I certainly have had people of all ranges and thoughts from those who are, it is the central core component of how they live and operate in the world, to those who have no beliefs at all. But there is some evidence for coping that seems to suggest that those who have some kind of system, foundational system, that is beneficial. Does that answer your question a little bit?
Sure.
Yeah. And we all have strong opinions about that.
There would probably be two things. One is that I don't see the here and now as better than the future.
You don't see the here and now as better than the future, and that helps you.
Right.
Yeah.
People ask me all the time, how can I worship a God that would allow me to have Parkinson? And my response to that is, how could I not worship a God who is smart enough to give me Parkinson's? To teach me the lessons that are what I have. Well, and that eventually I'll have a better body.
Yeah. So for you, it comes out of some Christian faith. What's interesting about that whole idea, which we didn't get into too much, is that every spiritual tradition also addresses suffering, which is what illness is, right? So it's how do I think about suffering and fairness in my life? Sometimes people come and one of their biggest barriers is, this isn't fair. This is so unfair to me. And it's unfair. But most people who are able to get to the point of saying, why not me instead of why me? Meaning, who am I to think that I should be exempt from a hardship in life when no one else in the world is. So we get to a lot of these really foundational philosophical belief systems that we all have that feed into how we cope and live with our illness, and secondarily then the grief and loss. Yeah. Another comment. Anybody else? Yeah.
During the 2003, I was in Seattle doing a bone marrow with stem cells. And it just, the doctors would say, okay, now it's your new normal.
Yeah.
Dealing with new normal time every day.
Yeah. That whole idea of new normals all the time, every day. And again, that's that cycle, isn't it? Life is steady for a little bit, or conditions are somewhat steady for a little bit. That's the normal. And then something gets rocked and there's another new normal. You have to go through it and find that new normal, and then another, and then another. And that's psychologically fatiguing at times, isn't it? That's wearing. That's wearing. Yeah.
To share something about resiliency.
Okay.
In one of the groups that I'm in, we practice this kind of memory. We go back, and maybe you're familiar with some of this, but we go back and we think of a nearby memory. Did the people online hear that at all? Okay. So I was just wanting to share something about how to build resiliency. So there's a group that I'm a part of, and we routinely go back into either a recent or distant memory, and that gave us joy. Sorry, that's the caveat. That gave us joy. And we linger in that memory, and we let the smells and the tastes and the emotion, come back to us in a way that is creating deeper resiliency, deeper joy that we can return to. I found it to be so profound.
Yeah. Yeah. So that whole idea of focusing on something pleasant from the past, I'll wait till that stops. And then I have a follow-up comment to that. Wait till are we good? You're doing good. You're doing good because it stopped. A follow-up to that is a number of years ago, I also provide services to the Huntington disease families, which is a really serious genetic neurological illness. And at one of their conferences, a psychologist spoke on resiliency. And a very, very simple exercise for resiliency is to ask yourself, maybe not every day, but several days a week, what's been the best part of this day so far? Even if it's 7 in the morning or 10 at night. So if I were to say that to you right now, or to those of you online, throw a couple things out. What's been the best part of your day so far?
Sausage biscuit I had for breakfast.
The sausage biscuit for breakfast. Okay, what else? Pilates. Beautiful day. I needed the coffee this morning, the first sip of my Starbucks coffee. That alone puts you into a sense of gratitude and saying, okay, even her next point was, even awful days still have their best parts. So it's at the end of an awful day and your symptoms have just been, ugh. Even awful days have their best parts, even if it's, thank goodness this day is done. The best part of this day is now because it's 10:30 and I can go to bed. That's it. Those are resiliency practices that we can exercise, and they do help. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Just a comment from Ed online. He says, dealing with grief challenges are.
It challenges our ability to stay in the moment. Does anybody have any thoughts or comments on that?
Oh yeah, I can see how it can send you way far forward out of anyone's control.
Mm-hmm.
Repeat what I said.
Bethany said it can send you way far forward and out of control into places that are in no one's control.
Yeah. And sometimes I think that's a fear, because we've all, if you're living with an illness where you have that sense of a loss of control and a loss of certainty, why do I want to invite more? And what if it even increases that loss more and I I don't get it back. There's that fear, I think. Yeah.
Speaking of fear, I think I also hear a lot like of getting in the emotion when maybe it's overwhelming, or instead of inviting it in, I don't want to get stuck in it, so I ignore it. I don't know if you have any thoughts or tips.
Yeah, I think that sense of being paralyzed or stuck can be very real, because we don't, it's that hope and reality again, isn't it? You know, the reality is, okay, I'm living with a condition that doesn't have a cure. And so I sit and think about these feelings. I'm still not going to have a cure. Why is there any benefit in there? Then you can get in that stuck cycle, which is why I like that simple strategy of, okay, now what? What can I do today? What do I want to think about doing as a way to say, okay, there's something that can be done. And, you know, not to overload on that concept of resiliency and coping, but before I had my practice, I worked for 7 years at Colorado Neurological Institute. And if some of you have been in this community a long time, a number of neuro patients would come there for outpatient treatment, PTOT speech. And then I did what I do now, only as part of a multidisciplinary team. And that always interested me to watch both patients and caregivers come. And it's always intriguing to see, why do some people cope the way they do? You know, we could see some really debilitated individuals yet have an outlook that was pretty balanced, because they were using some of these practices that were still trying to keep that balance and that outlook in their life. And others whose conditions maybe were quite well managed and yet were very stuck. And what is that about us? And a lot of it is some of these resiliency practices. Some of it is unresolved stuff from the past that was affecting how they were dealing with the losses and the changes that were coming their way that needed to be worked on. The stuckness can be real for some people. Yeah. Any other questions, comments?
So I need to let my mom know when they let our dog on too. You're affecting people.
Yeah, yeah, that was a good example. Yeah. Mhm.
Something about not being able to grief is about not being able to say goodbye or not being able to do something about it now. The dog and my mother are both things.
Mhm.
That you just
Mhm. But it is possible to work that through.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I love to write the letter
Mhm.
to your mom.
Mhm.
You no idea kind of thing,
Mhm.
yeah.
And just to give you an example of how the example with the dog, while he was away at college and then not learning about it till after the fact, just to give you an example then of why that was important, is one of his challenges right now is how to deal with his young children in terms of what to say about grandma, because this is a beloved grandmother. So one of the things he put together was that my parents were doing that to shield me. It was well-intentioned to shield me, but it didn't help me. I mean, I could have handled that. And they were shielding me. And that came out of what they thought was a good thing as a parent. So now the conversation then shifts to, how much am I shielding my children right now by not saying something that's going to become pretty evident here? So you see then how an experience from the past is shaping how he was subconsciously starting to handle some things in his own present around loss within his own family. That's an example of how these things move forward. Yeah, we have a comment right here.
About the guilt that you feel about your family having to do.
How about the guilt that you feel about the burden you place on your family? Do you want to say any more about that? No. So it's guilt, not as much loss, but more guilt, which is very common. It's a framework question. I'll explain that. So what what you read about guilt is guilt comes when someone has actually done something to intentionally harm. And so sometimes we assign things, assign labels to ourselves that aren't fair and that put us in a position that doesn't help us. Many caregivers also feel very guilty. I'm not doing a good enough job. I mean, if I was doing a better job. So it's present for both. And yet, in the vast experience of the people I work with, people are doing the best they can. That's that mantra again, you know. And so to simply stop yourself and say, wait a minute, do I need to feel guilty? Did I do something intentionally to cause harm here? No. Okay, I will choose, I won't choose guilt, I'll choose sadness. But now how do we partner together? How do we partner together? But it's hard, it's hard. Not easily, sometimes it's a recurring exercise you have to do with yourself. Yeah. Illness, we never go out and seek illness. And you know, one of the resources there is a book called How to Be Sick. And that author, she is a longtime practicing Buddhist, but her book just went into a second printing in the last couple of years because she was a really successful law professor in California and came down with what appears to be one of the really chronic kind of fatigue, really nasty kind of illnesses after an international trip and never recovered years ago, but decided to start writing as she felt she could. It took a long time, about some of her Buddhist thinking helped her, and became well received enough by people of all kinds of beliefs and backgrounds because of some of the strategies and things, the concepts she talked about. And one of them is, you know, this idea, that idea we talked about earlier of not why me, but why not me? Who am I to think that suffering shouldn't come my way? You know, that's one of the Buddhist concepts. And her comment in her book is something along the lines of, mind, we all have it, we all are going to have suffering, mine just happened to come when it did. The comment in the back over here, yeah.
The way I often think about it is, I didn't seek this, but it found me anyway. And now what do I do with it so that my gratitude for what I do have wins?
Yeah, let me see if I can repeat that for everybody. The way you think about it is, I didn't seek it, but it found me anyway. And now what do I do about it so that my gratitude wins? That's fabulous. That takes you right through some of those steps, doesn't it? And you know, that doesn't mean we're good at that every single day. That doesn't mean that we expect you to be 100% with how you look at your outlook every single day. But that's what you strive for. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, a very good point. All righty. Anything else, Meredith?
No, does anyone have any additional thoughts, comments? Okay, a lot to think about. Yeah, Greg.
Part of that is yes, it's one of the things that you really feel the Parkinson taken away from you. And prior to Parkinson's, I was a warlord of commerce and rock. I showed no emotion. Motion is weak and that kind of thing. After I developed Parkinson's, I'd watch McDonald's ads and start crying. He mentioned the thing, I think it's called pseudobulbar.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
and taught me a little trick on, you know, when you feel that emotion welling up in you, Because I still unfortunately see it as wrong,
Mhm.
although my children have mentioned that
Mhm. Mm.
practice.
Mhm.
That they prefer the kinder and gentler.
Uh, uh, yeah, a different kind of you. You're still you. Yeah,
Everything is in the context.
yeah, yeah. So the comment for those of you online is that everything is in context, that when you had your neuropsych testing, just thinking, you had always been a kind of person who was matter of fact, to the point, emotions weren't terribly high, that you didn't have to face them too much in your life, and how you started having this, what some people experience as kind of a pseudo Ballbar effect, which is when you're kind of overcome by emotions, even with benign experiences like a McDonald's ad, and now learning a strategy for how to deal with that. And there's also a medication for that as well, but that your children appreciate the kinder, softer you that allows those emotions to be more evident. Yeah. Those are some of the lessons of suffering and the lessons of illness that we can learn from, whether we're the person with the condition or a care partner. Yeah. Yeah. Most of the lessons we learn don't come out of ease and convenience. They come out of suffering and hardship. That's true for all of us. If we're open. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for sharing. This has been really wonderful. Yeah. Thank you, Lucy. Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah. And we'll have this available after as a recording, and the handouts are in the chat if you're joining us virtually. But please let us know if you have additional thoughts and questions. We'd love your feedback. So Bethany is going to pass around the feedback forms, and we have that online as well. And then our last series, our last speaking topic is next Thursday, where we'll be navigating the winding paths of acceptance, as well as just taking some time in our tables and small groups to kind of come back to these big topics that we've really been processing over the last 6 weeks, and share additional thoughts, ways of, I love the thought, what next? Next, what do we do with all of this information? So that's in our final session next week. Can you believe it? The 6 series went fast. So, all right. Thank you, everyone.